Welcome, welcome to Casual Politics, Mr. Brake, Tom Brake. Thank you very much. First, congratulations for your re-election.
Thank you.
And before that we start, just a few thoughts on the death of your colleague, Charles Kennedy.
Well, clearly very sad. My heart goes out to his family and particularly his young son, who unfortunately will grow up without a father, which is really tragic. Charles made a fantastic contribution to the Liberal Democrats. Of course, in 2005 he took the party up to over 60 members of Parliament, the largest number of third-party Liberal MPs that there has been in recent history. And of course he took a very prominent role in the campaign against the war in Iraq, something that united the Liberal Democrats. We were the only political party at the time that was campaigning against the war, and the position that he and I think we adopted at the time has now been vindicated in that the war there has been a disaster.
And what impact did it have on him to lose his seat after 32 years serving in Parliament?
Well, I hadn't spoken to him after the election, but clearly for him and other colleagues, and indeed even colleagues who were re-elected, it has been a very tough 3 or 4 weeks for us. In his case, he had invested over 30 years in his constituency, working on behalf of his constituents, and I know that he would have been very badly affected and hurt by the outcome of the election.
And do you agree that he was the most successful Liberal Democrat leader, the one who actually, as you mentioned it, won 62 seats for his party?
Yes, and in recent history, without a doubt, he has been the most successful, and I think one of the reasons why he was so successful is because he was able to relate to people. He was a politician that perhaps people didn't think of as a politician. They just thought of him as someone that they liked to spend time with, someone who was friendly, open, and didn't perhaps go for the jugular in the way that some politicians do. If he wanted to criticise an opponent, he would use wit to do that rather than a full-on assault.
And at the time that your party needs to rebuild itself, do you think that he's a great loss to your party?
He clearly is a great loss to the party, someone of his principle, someone who displayed the steel that he did in relation to Iraq is clearly a very big loss to the party.
And now about the general election, was it actually more punishing, the results? Were they more punishing and crushing than you were expecting them to be?
Yes, our worst, the worst possible outcome on the night we thought was that we might only end up with 25 seats. So to end up with just 8 was a shock for the party. And what we haven't had an opportunity to do yet is to look at the reasons why. And we can clearly guess some of them, or we're aware of some of them in terms of for instance, the impact that being in government had on a group of people who previously supported us, perhaps as a means of protesting against the government of the day. Now that we were the government of the day, clearly those people wouldn't support us anymore. So there are lots of lessons to be learned, and we need to go through that process, and I'm sure that we will do that in the next few weeks. And our leadership contenders, at the moment Norman Lamb or Tim Farron, they I think will also have a role in the leadership contest of setting out where they think things went wrong and what they, if they were to become the party leader, what they would do differently.
And apart from the tuition fees, in which areas do you think that actually the electorate punished you for?
Well, to be honest, I think that was the main issue. Often when people said, "Oh yes, I don't trust you because of tuition fees," when they were challenged about is there anything else, often that was the only thing that they could throw at us. And in some ways, I'm surprised and disappointed with the impact that it had, because yes, we weren't able to deliver that policy, but in practice, if the Conservatives had agreed to our policy, it would have been implemented. They didn't, yet we were the ones that got the flak for not being able to deliver what was our policy. And the Labour Party, of course, managed to escape the same degree of sort of bile when they, before the 97 election, said that they wouldn't introduce tuition fees, and when they got elected with a majority of 200 MPs, they then promptly did that. And then before the next election, they said they wouldn't introduce top-up fees for students. And then after the next election, when again they had a huge majority, they didn't have to negotiate with anyone, they introduced top-up fees. But they managed to escape the level of criticism that we did in relation to us not being able to deliver that policy in coalition.
And do you think, was it unfair that the electorate rewarded the Conservatives for successes of the coalition government, such as the economy, and punish you for the failures of the coalition government?
Yes, I do think that was unfair. It was not, to some extent, unexpected, because the experience in other European countries is that when coalitions are formed, it's often the case that the larger party is able to take credit for anything positive the government has done, and it's often the case that the smaller party in the coalition gets the brickbats for the things that didn't work successfully. So we weren't perhaps surprised, but the scale of the punishments that was meted out, I think, was something that we were not expecting.
In your opinion, what important role did your party play in creating jobs?
Without a doubt, the Liberal Democrats in government, and I think in their more candid moments a lot of Conservative ministers would accept this, played a very significant role. Key people like Vince Cable, Secretary of State for Business, key people like Ed Davey, Secretary of State at Energy and Climate Change, were really central to an agenda of growing jobs, but also creating apprenticeships, which in turn feeds through into jobs because people are better skilled, better able to take the jobs that are available. So yes, absolutely, the Liberal Democrats played a central role in turning around the economy, the British economy, creating the 2 million jobs, starting or finishing the 2 million apprenticeships that have happened since 2010, and keeping inflation low, keeping interest rates low, and turning the economy around so that growth in the British economy was one of the best in the world.
And indeed you blocked some of Tories' legislations to put forward to the House, including Snoopers Charter bill, but now if they want to put forward it, you could not block it anymore.
Well, we will fight against that particular proposal, the Snoopers Charter. And what the Snoopers Charter will do is it will give the government the power to capture information about every single web page that the 40 million Britons who access the web each week. That will enable the government to capture that information at every single web page those 40 million people are accessing, and holding on to that information for a year. Now, we know that with things like Snowden that sometimes that information gets into the wrong hands and then is widely publicised. The cost associated with it is exorbitant. The cost currently is estimated at £1.8 billion, but we know that when it comes to IT projects, they often overrun very significantly. If that level of funding is available for that, in my view, there are better ways of spending that money if we want to tackle terrorism. And that's what this has got to be about. What is the best use of that money? And I don't think that is the best use of it. And
referendum, your party, there was a row before the election between Vince Cable and Nick Clegg, because Nick Clegg, he was preparing himself for another coalition, so he was preparing for a referendum on Europe, and Vince Cable, but however he wasn't. So now that Labour, they prepared to actually, they in favour of a referendum. Where is your party positioning itself now?
Well, my personal view is that the referendum is happening. So as a party, we need to get behind this. We need to, in my view, have the referendum as soon as possible. I think 2017 is too late. I think we should have it sooner than that, because as long as there is the prospect of a referendum, a very clear prospect, it's going to happen. I think until the outcome is known for business, that means that investment's likely to be put on hold. Business becomes uncertain about what the future holds. So it's in our interest to move forward with it as quickly as possible. And clearly, Liberal Democrats, we will be arguing that it's in the UK's interest to stay in the EU. Yes, there is need for reform, and if David Cameron is able to secure some reforms in discussions with Angela Merkel and other leaders in Europe, that would be a good thing. But the principle of us being part of a market of 500 million people, the biggest and wealthiest market in the world, the principle of us being able to export without any restrictions, without any trade barriers, without any arbitrary obstacles in the way of British companies, is a good thing, just as it's a good thing to be able to, for instance, live and work in another EU country. One thing that the opponents of the EU have not really responded to is what do they think will be the impact if the UK were to leave the EU on the 1.5 million British citizens who live in other EU countries? What will be the impact in terms of lost opportunities, for instance, that young people will have? Often when I go to schools in Carshot and Wallington, I say, one of the reasons why I want us to stay in the EU is because when you graduate, when you start work in whatever field, engineering, law, medicine, at some point you may want to go and work in another EU country. As long as we're part of the European Union, you can do that without any restrictions. You can't go and work in Australia, America, or any other country in the world. Just like that, you will find that there are going to be things put in your way. Whereas as long as we're part of the European Union, those opportunities remain open to you.
But still, there are some countries in Europe, such as Norway, that they're not part of the European Union, they're not marginalized from that trade to trade with other European countries. So, what is wrong then if Britain decide to leave the European Union?
Well, what Norway have said, and I think it was either their Prime Minister or their President has said very recently, is don't do what we have done. Because, of course, what Norway has to do is Norway has to comply, when they export goods to the EU, they have to comply with all the EU rules and regulations. As I understand it, they have to make a financial contribution towards the EU, which is greater than if they were actually members of the EU. And therefore, of course, because they're outside the EU, they do not have a table, a chair around the table when there are discussions about EU rules and regulations. They're not party. They have no means of influencing that, yet they have to comply with all the rules and regulations. So that is what Norway have said about the impact it has on them of actually being outside the EU. So when people say, those who want to come out of the EU, it'll be much simpler, we won't have to comply with any of these rules and regulations, we'll be able to do our own thing, that is not true. Because the UK, if it exports goods to the EU, will still be subject to the same rules and regulations. But if we're outside of the EU, there won't be anyone from the UK arguing for simplifying the rules and regulations, because we will not be allowed to be around the table where those discussions are taking place.
And how likely is that the Prime Minister comes back from Brussels with all his reforms that he wanted?
Well, we don't know what all of the reforms that he wants are, and I think that's one of the major weaknesses. It's very difficult for anyone to know what it is that the Prime Minister is trying to negotiate. Sometimes he and other ministers will reel off a couple of things that they think are important, but we don't actually have any knowledge about whether they're really red lines or not. If he is, for instance, making a red line stopping freedom of movement within the EU, then he's lost already, because it's very clear the other EU countries will not agree to something that stops freedom of movement within the European Union, because that is one of the fundamental principles of it. If he's into negotiating about perhaps changes to benefits, delaying people getting access to benefits, then I think he will find that other EU countries may be more amenable to that. But the honest truth is we do not know what it is he is trying to negotiate, and we do not know at what point he will feel he has won the argument and can come back to the UK and say, I've got the deal, I'm now going to sell it to you, and I want to stay in the EU.
And if Britain decides to leave the EU, do you think that the Scottish, what will be the implications for Scotland, and will the Scottish people call for another independence?
That would be quite a tricky constitutional issue, I think, because I think the constituent nations, so England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, I think they can have their viewpoint, and I think it would be very difficult for the Conservative government if they were to hold a referendum, find that the population votes against staying in the EU, given that the Scottish, I think, and the Welsh, and I think also Northern Ireland would all, I think, as separate nations, because they actually see benefits of the EU, want to stay within it. So I think that would cause a bit of a controversy and a bit of a constitutional upheaval if that was the outcome.
And are you in favour of Chancellor's plan to devolve more power to England?
I'm certainly in favour of the Chancellor's plan to devolve more power to England, because we cannot have a situation where Scotland, as they are arguing, has, for instance, complete fiscal autonomy to do what it wants without English MPs being able to cast a vote on how Scotland spends its money, while Scottish MPs continue to be able to vote in critical issues that affect England and Wales MPs, for instance. So we do need a different settlement. But what I'm worried about is that the government's proposals, which are really about, to some extent, fiddling with the standing orders in the House of Commons, that does not, in my view, provide the firm footing that is needed to reform our constitution, because that is what this has got to be about. We clearly need to give more powers to Scotland, more powers to Wales, more powers to Northern Ireland, more powers to the English, but within in effect, a federal framework. It is such a major change that we have argued, I think with very strong justification, that this can only be done through a constitutional convention where you would get all the parties who are interested and the public who have views on this as well to set out how they think we should reform this, what sort of level of devolution should there be, how many more powers should we grant to individual regions if they call for it, whether it's Cornwall or Yorkshire. We need to have a debate. We cannot simply make a tweak to the standing orders in the House of Commons to try and reflect better what I think we all want to see, which is giving English MPs a greater say in English matters.
But already there was a vote that British people had to cast their votes whether if they wanted more mayors. And clearly they voted against. They didn't vote against it, but the turnout was very low. So
yes, and what my worry is that the new government have an obsession with mayors. I think for them, mayors is the solution to everything. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think the public have a right to work out what they think is the right way of structuring whatever sort of overall political body is going to manage their affairs, and it is not the business of government to say from on high, you've got to have a mayor, and many regions don't actually want that. So the government have got to be more flexible. They haven't got to impose a solution. By not imposing a solution, what we could well end up with is quite a messy structure, because you could have places like Cornwall which took on additional powers. You could have places like Greater Manchester which took on different powers. You could have other parts of the country, perhaps some of the home counties, where they're not interested in taking on any additional powers at all. You'd end up with something that was messy, but I think it would reflect better what the public, what the voters wanted in those different areas. In Cornwall there's a strong sense of identity, perhaps there's less so in the home counties. There's clearly a strong sense of identity in Yorkshire. We should have something that is flexible enough in terms of being able to give people powers if they want them, or if they don't want them, they stay in the centre.
And do you agree with the public that they said there is too much power concentrated in Westminster?
I agree entirely. The Westminster system is still a very centralised system. Under the coalition government, with my party's input, steps were taken to devolve power. That's very welcome. We know that all the parties are committed to devolving more power to Scotland. Logically, it would then flow more powers to Wales, which is happening, to Northern Ireland, to England, or to the regions in England. All of that is logical, and I think that would be better for our democracy, because Whitehall can't command everything that happens throughout the United Kingdom. We need to give more power to local people, and the impact of that would be, I think, to make people feel more connected with politics. Obviously at the moment one of the biggest problems we've got is that people do not feel particularly close to their politicians, to where the decisions are being taken. If they're being taken at a much more local level, then I think people would have more ownership of those decisions, and I think that would be better for democracy.
And at the beginning of our conversation you talked about the leadership contest. Have you decided that which candidate will you back?
I'm backing Norman Lamb.
And
although I think Tim Farron would equally be a good leader, but I'm backing Norman.
And and in what way do you think that his task will be difficult to rebuild your party?
well, whoever it is, whether it's Norman or Tim, they have both got a very, very difficult task ahead of them. They've got to reinvigorate the party. Clearly 15,000 new members joining helps that process, but they've got to help define a clear identity for the party. One of the risks, again, that we knew about was if you go into coalition and you're the smaller party, your identity tends to get blurred or lost, and people don't recognise that you're, what you stand for. So we've got to redefine that or make it clearer for people. They've obviously got to think about what is it that we can offer the public, which we clearly failed to do 3 weeks ago in terms of the general election, because they didn't vote for us in sufficient numbers. So what is our offer to the public? How are we going to put that across? But as I said, I think the fact that 15,000 people within a couple of weeks of the party suffering a very bad election loss have wanted to join the party, have shown their commitment to there being a continued Liberal Democrat presence in Parliament, is something that I take comfort from.
And do you agree? Because the day after the general election, some of Liberals' grandees, such as David Steele, they said that the Liberal dream is over for at least 30 years.
I'm sure that's not going to be the case, and I am very pleased to be one of the MPs who will there to fight to turn it around much sooner than that. We're already seeing the reasons why the Liberal Democrats did make a difference in the previous government with some of the policies that the Tories are putting forward. I think that will become even clearer as months go by. It will become clearer when George Osborne announces his emergency budget, which will announce or presumably identify where the £12 billion worth of welfare cuts that he wasn't willing to talk about in the run-up to the general election, where they will come from. So I think we've got an opportunity in front of us, which we are going to grasp and fight very hard to make sure that Liberal Democrat values about fairness, justice, equality are represented effectively in Parliament.
And my last question is that, in your opinion, what are the challenges that the Tory government will face for the next 5 years in government?
The big challenge over the next 3 years is that there is still a huge amount of money that needs to be taken out of this public spending to deal with the deficit. So that is a real challenge for them. They also have a political challenge, which is that whilst they have a majority in the Commons, first of all, it's a small majority, and we've already seen the U-turn on the Human Rights Act. That happened because the Tories realised that they did not have a majority. There were too many very prominent, very respected Conservative MPs who were saying, we're not buying this. People like Kenneth Clarke, that they had to back off that. But the even bigger problem they face, of course, is that they have absolutely no majority in the House of Lords. The House of Lords has the ability to block, or at least to delay,